Hey guys, this section is the compartment of truth, and we're going to be talking about how people are compartmentalized and how that prevents them from seeing outside of that compartment. And I want to start off with something Josh McDowell wrote, the author of the book, The Evidence That Demands a Verdict. He said in his second edition, or whatever edition I have, sometimes truth is confused with what a majority of people at a particular time or place think is true. And that holds a lot of weight. That's just a real powerful quote in the context of this section. And I can't make or contend that any Christian group or denomination is the true church while all others are false. I've been down that road before. But in my experience, I've been able to find nuggets of truth from different writers, different researchers, different denominations even. I mean, a lot of people have certain aspects of truth. It's true. I mean, the scripture says here a little and there a little. I know that's a little out of context, but I love that phrase, how it talks about how there's different bits and pieces of information in different places, basically. And topics that intrigue one group of individuals might be different than another group's point of interest or individuals. So some groups may be enlightened about one aspect of truth and that other groups are overlooking. That's just the way it is. And the separating factor between all of these different believers might simply be their denomination and what each community emphasizes. And that's pretty much the problem, denominationalism. It limits Christians from exposure to the truth. Now, I would imagine that maybe a lot of you, I don't know who all listens to these videos or who all has read the book, but I know a lot of people are affiliated with a certain denomination, and so they may question how your affiliation would limit you from receiving truth. And the answer is simple. Truth is often compartmentalized. It works no differently than different cultures and different regions of the world. Certain customs that one region might be familiar with, or a group of people in a certain area, it's going to be different than others. And so the characteristics, if you compare that to the churches, there's going to be characteristics and beliefs of one denomination that are going to be different than another group because of what each community is exposed to theologically. So despite that, we have to understand that truth doesn't exist in one compartment alone. And from what I've observed, truth is rarely found at one polar extreme. Like this church, we are the true church, we're the only church, and everyone else is a false church. It's not that simple. Truth is usually found somewhere in between all of these different groups. And like I said, I haven't always felt this way. My personal experience is now a testimony of how I broke free from that mentality. And I'm going to just suggest to everyone that your theology should develop over time. If you were to read my first book, I don't have it here with me right now, but I've thrown it up there a few times. It was called "What Itching Ears Don't Want to Hear," and you would notice that my approach in that book is in stark contrast with what I am now talking about in Crushing Conceptualism. Itching Ears, it was written during a time when I was unaware of the concept of compartmentalization, but I displayed the effects. even though, I mean, I delivered in that book what at the time what I believed to be a solid disclosure of the false doctrines among Christianity, I was sorely misguided about many of the details just because I was compartmentalized and I was not exposed to a lot of information that was out there. And so a lot of the details that led to my conclusion, it was just because I was missing information. And I'll still say that even though amidst, my circumstances when I wrote that book, there were still occasional hints of the same inquisitive nature like that you see now in me. I had this same desire to learn, and I was just excited to find new things to add to my understanding. So you'll still see that in the other book, and it's not something I'd recommend that people read because it's totally off as far as the doctrines and everything that I try to bring out. But that same inquisitive nature that I had even back then, it's kind of steered me in a completely different direction. And I remember even in the opening of that book, in I think the first chapter, I have it written down here. I added it to CCMC. It says, "The Lord may call us out from that which we are accustomed to in order for us to advance spiritually, no matter what our current circumstance, denomination, or religion may be." Now, during that time, I never considered how relevant that statement would be because I was writing it from a position where I wanted everyone else to leave what they were doing and come to that's funny. But I never imagined how far God would lead me today. And I stand by that statement, still convinced that it's because I learned how to be teachable. And not long after I published that book, I was faced with even more compelling information that challenged my core beliefs tremendously. And in turn, my research methods began to progress. My approach to certain topics began to shift, and my discernment, it continued to advance. So as a result, my theology ultimately developed because of that. During that time and when I was writing my first book, I wasn't just missing pieces of the puzzle. I was more inclined to confirmation bias. And I was persuaded in some regard that my church organization and my fellow organizations of the same faith, there's a 3-point doctrinal statement of faith that basically categorizes you all together. Even though you might be a part of a different organization, you still hold to that belief system. From our perspective, many of the doctrines and experiences associated with our movement appeared to match the teachings of the New Testament more closely than other groups. And looking back, I can show you why I was off on a lot of points. But for a time, I held to that persuasion that, hey, we are that remnant, that true church that God's sending, but it's kind of a closed-minded, naive. You don't see how God is working in other areas and other people's lives, and that He is using other people because you're so compartmentalized. And that's kind of what I'm trying to describe. That's what I'm trying to bring out. It was just a matter of compartmentalization. I was limited to an interpretation of Scripture that was unanimously agreed upon by the founders of a single church organization. So a couple of guys got together, started this organization. They had their interpretations, and it just kind of grew. And I was basically, and what a lot of people, what all of them are doing is they're saying, hey, we're going to stick to that and not go outside of that. Those core doctrines, and there's three. I've talked about those three core doctrines in some other videos, and that if you don't agree with those three doctrines, you're not a part of this faith. You've never received the revelation. That is how they will say it. Anyway, by selectively emphasizing, I'm going to use that term a lot, selective emphasis. And That's just what I like to say. It's a way I kind of like to describe confirmation bias. It's it's because of selective emphasis on certain Bible passages, and we a lot of times we will neglect many other scriptures that are just as pertinent in the New Testament because we are selectively emphasizing what we want to focus on and what we want others to focus on. We want others to be in our compartment and focus on the same few things that are in the bigger picture. It doesn't matter. I'm reminded of a verse where Christ was talking about you focus on the little things and the weightier things. I can't remember where it's found, but hopefully you know what I'm talking about. But there's danger with that mentality. It leads a person to believe that other groups or individuals are less saved or even not saved at all if they don't profess the same articles of faith that you do. And I've seen this. And I just hate to see how it's just, I have certain people in mind that I still see who are just paralyzed and they are bound by compartmentalized thinking. And I hate to use the term brainwashed, but the faith that I came out of, or the doctrine, the indoctrination, I use that word a lot, it has people bound in a state of paralysis. And it's not my intention. I'm not trying to speak negatively about the movement that I was a part of. And I know a lot of my statements are going to be confused as having a negative connotation. But in this organization, there is a potential to develop forms of legalism. And if you don't conform to the traditions or the customs generally encouraged by that group, then you're going to be viewed as a lesser vessel, basically not as important, or someone who just probably doesn't get the revelation, or they're just not there. If you don't match their ideal product, if you don't fit that mold, if you're not doing everything that they're preaching or teaching, it's going to occur, not only regarding certain convictions or standards, but also what is viewed as biblical truth. And it's getting into that sacred calf we call theology. And so any information that didn't come from within our own theological community, it was deemed an unreliable source. And if an idea challenged or even suggested something contrary to what was preached from our pulpits, it was considered false doctrine, whether it was true or not, because it didn't match our interpretation of the gospel. And so from this perspective, other denominations weren't just considered other churches, they were false churches simply because of the differences. And I've heard that word thrown around so many times. On a more personal level, I begin to sense a very heavy spirit of elitism radiating from the pulpits. And it was spiritual, it was doctrinal, and it was hierarchical elitism, if that makes sense. And, we a lot of times we see these types of characteristics in I have pseudo-Christian establishments such as Jehovah's Witnesses. And I don't know, maybe I shouldn't have labeled them as a pseudo-Christianist. But that's another discussion for another time. But these behaviors aren't just limited to people and groups like that. I've found multiple denominations who have displayed the same dogmatic approach, and especially in the organization that I was a part of. I was a part of a Oneness Pentecostal church, and if you're not familiar with that, then you'll know just how dogmatic they can be about their doctrines. And they call it confidence, but when I was a part of it, I was saying, I'm not arrogant, I'm confident. And it turns out that the other was true. And I had to humble myself. I was cocky about it. But it's just kind of the way they train you to be. They kind of raise you up as theological bulldogs. But I didn't always see it this way. Like during that time when I was under their teaching, I was completely on board with their bold doctrinaire. And earlier in my ministry, I was considered by them as I was considered to be an anointed minister with the gift of teaching. And I remember hearing some statements and similar comments that I'm going to list off here in a second. The leadership. I have 5 bullet points, and I heard these from the ministry. They'd say, God has anointed you with the office of a teacher. God has placed a mantle over you to teach. God has gifted you with the ability to write. God will use your insight to bring others closer to truth. And writing Bible studies is your ministry. So I would hear statements like that. Those are some that I specifically remember. And during that time, it was common for members of the congregation to approach me with questions about the Bible. And the leadership even referred others to me for this reason, because they were aware that I devoted more time in study than others. And that's not something I'm not trying to put myself on a pedestal, as they say, or I'm not trying to puff myself up or make myself more. I'm just telling you how it is. Everybody else was watching the football game, playing video games, doing all this other stuff, and I'm sitting here like reading them, and I'm wanting to talk about Bible topics all the time. And I think it got to the point where I was just annoying to some of the people in my church because of how much I wanted to talk about study topics. And I know that's sad to say, especially from people in a church. So I don't know. A lot of times I was asked to teach classes and write Bible studies for discipleship courses. And so there were multiple ministers, pastors, and bishops and elders that encouraged me to continue to write and teach whatever God revealed to me, until some of the things that God revealed to me began to challenge the traditional views of the organization. And after the leadership noticed that I was questioning our fundamental views, I was instructed. They said, never question what has already been settled. Don't look for new revelations. And they throw that term out, new revelations, because they use that phrase in a negative way. Don't look for new revelations when we already have the truth. But I mean, despite the opposition, I couldn't ignore the findings of my research. The evidence was overwhelming. There were undeniable flaws in the theology of this organization. And to me, it was a serious charge, because this denomination claimed to be the true church while suggesting that all others were false. So, and around that time, I guess as a result, it was suggested that I wasn't being submissive to my superiors. But I felt like I was doing the right thing. Author Rory Moore, I love what he says. Rory Moore, he wrote the book, The Tithe That Binds. And I remember something he wrote, not in that book, but something else. He does a lot of blogging. He wrote, I realized I could not be in rebellion if I was not persuaded of something. I just love that. I love that phrase, or that quote, that excerpt from the article that he wrote that in. This was my story. I found several inconsistencies in doctrine, and I wasn't silent about it. In my second book, Decoding Precepts of Oneness Theology, it was intended to resolve many of those flaws, and it was designed with an honest approach. I mean, it was an effort to convince the leadership that we've either overlooked or simply just misunderstood certain details about our doctrine, or details that led us to believe the doctrines we believe. But unfortunately, that book was confused basically as a theological diatribe or a polemic against that organization. You know how some people will write a book and then another person who basically writes a book to say why his belief is wrong. That's kind of how they took it. And it wasn't meant to be that way. It was just meant to question a lot of things. And I think it's because I interacted with the superintendent of one of the organizations, like the top dog who's written a lot of books. I use a lot of his material in my book, and then I will tell why I think some of the things need to be looked at again. So I don't know. I understand. Yeah, it could be classified as that, I guess. I don't know. It was confused as a polemic. Anyway, but for someone whose ministry was highly regarded by the leadership, it was for a while, I was now considered someone who had dabbled around with strange fire. And the same leaders who previously confirmed spiritual gifting in my life were now going back on their words. I was no longer considered a credible source for teaching. My relationship with God, it was no longer relevant to them. My character, my lifestyle, it didn't matter. And much to my disappointment, I noticed that their judgment about my character changed when they realized I no longer observed their core doctrines. And because I questioned and challenged what I found inconsistent, they considered that to be a sign that I was ill-spirited. So I was accused of being combative. And regardless of the fruits manifested in my life, the visible signs, there was no honor. And from their perspective, I could no longer be a suitable representation of their organization. So basically, to them, I was now dangerous, and they have used that word. But the mistake they're making is you can't equate your disagreement with doctrine to a person's character, and that's what they were doing. I think that's what hurt most, is that just because we now disagreed, they were trying to say that I had all these character flaws when I didn't. My personality and character never changed. My attitude's kind of changed a little bit. Now, doesn't mean I have a bad attitude. It's just my eyes have been opened a lot. I mean, I'd imagine from their position, it was an effort to keep unity among the body. I know that's what they're doing. You know, they can probably consider me a schism in the body or whatever. And they had to set boundaries in our relationship. I get it. I understand. But from my position, I found more comfort knowing that I could identify with Peter in the book of Acts. You remember this story? And he, you know, they were preaching in the name of Jesus, and the Pharisees were like, "Shut up," you know. And he was like, "You know what? Whether it's right in the sight of God to listen to you more than God, you guys judge. But we can't keep from speaking the things that we've seen and heard." And so I guess similar to Nate Wolf's story, God worked in my life by opening the door to further opportunities. In the last video, I talked about Nate's testimony. But I guess that's kind of what God's doing in my life, as he took me from one situation and then put me in another situation. He's opened the door, like the door to further opportunities, including this. The book that I'm basing these videos off of. And looking back, and here it is. This is the point of the Compartment of Truth. Looking back, I can now see it. And my situation, it was the result of it. My story demonstrated its effects. It was some type of external fluence or perceptual element, whatever. It was an influence that said, there's nothing closer to the truth outside these four walls. And the organization that I was a part of, that influence is there very heavily. Nothing outside, nothing closer to the truth than what we have. That's the attitude that, and it attempted to place boundaries around everything God was trying to do or accomplish through me. Its intention was to prevent me from thinking for myself, thinking outside the box. And so this it that I'm referring to is compartmentalization. It was one of those situations where you can't see it while you're in it until you begin to break free from it and separate yourself. And once you come out of it, you have a clearer understanding of what you were a part of. And that's the purpose of this book. It's to look at some of our beliefs from an outside view, to get away from the conceptual mindset, to break free from the limited compartment of Christianity. And a good friend of mine, David Laser, I have a few quotes in my book from him. And he said, don't know where he wrote this, but I stole it anyway. I said, hey, Dave, let me use this? He said, sure. So he says, there is a fear in religious people. I like that he used religious, but he says there's a fear in religious people to be led astray by other religious beliefs outside of their own. Their fear places them in a prison where their knowledge of God stays within the boundaries of their denomination. There is such a hunger for knowledge, even in the religious world, but it is limited to what we believe is good or evil. And then he goes on to say that true knowledge and wisdom comes from a relationship with the source of all knowledge and wisdom. Lean not on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. My advice would be to never stop seeing, never stop searching. Don't ever, we should never stop seeing development in our theology. It should always continue to grow. If we believe the same doctrines our entire lives, it only reflects that we have never searched out information ourselves. If we blindly accept everything we were raised to believe, then we're only following tradition, the traditions of men, by not seeking truth out ourselves. And I've heard it from the pulpits, and a lot of individuals, a lot of brothers and sisters, people I would consider brothers and sisters throughout my walk. I would hear this phrase a lot in that organization, in that denomination. They would say, well, I was raised in the truth, but, and this is not, I'm not bashing anybody, but that's a very naive statement. Quite frankly, it's an arrogant statement. And it could be a fair statement if you were to refer to a specific topic, or even just an acknowledgement of the Christian faith in general. Just say, I was raised in the truth. I was raised as a Christian. Something generalized like that, okay, I can see. But when you're talking about an entire line of theology, and if you're using that phrase, I was raised in the truth, referring to your denomination and all others being false, which is how that phrase was being spoken, that's an arrogant statement. But I mean, nobody is doctrinally inerrant on all subjects. And that would only eliminate the continual learning process, which defeats the purpose of aiming towards perfection. And it also displays a certain behavior that Paul recognized in certain types of individuals in his day. Remember the book of 1 Timothy? He says they want to be teachers of the law, yet they don't understand either what they're talking about or the things about which they speak of so confidently. And so I can see that same characteristic in the people that I was once associated with. Everyone's going to be judged individually according to what we choose to do with the knowledge that we've embraced. And at the same time, if we're content believing everything we were raised to believe, this is complacent behavior. If we don't seek further understanding, won't we be judged? Are we not going to be held accountable for that, to our lack of due diligence? I mean, it's good to have a solid foundation to build on, but we can't stop short of further information that can be acquired. So, and it wasn't until I chose to challenge my own beliefs that I realized there was a world of information from which I limited myself. And after the leadership of the church rejected the challenges that I presented, I realized my purpose was bigger than what I previously assumed. The organization was holding me back from what God was calling me to accomplish. Well, at any rate, I believe it was my teachable attitude that allowed for these doors to open. Anyway, in this regard, we should expect our theology to change, occasionally at least, if we're diligently searching for truth above tradition. And despite what might separate us, we can't afford to limit ourselves when God intends on restoring truth to his church. It doesn't matter what denomination we may be affiliated with. Just because an organization may claim to be the true church, it doesn't mean that all others are false. It just demonstrates what the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Corinth. First letter, chapter 13:12, it says, Paul says, we now see only an indistinct image in a mirror, but then we will be face to face. Now what I know is incomplete, but then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And a lot of people are familiar with this. The wording in the KJV, he talks about a glass darkly is the phrase that he uses. Basically, what we perceive now is only a partial aspect of the entire picture. And Paul's talking about everyone. You know, he didn't think, oh, here's an organization over here who does have that full revelation of truth. You know? So a lot of people who say that, I mean, they're just, I don't know. He's describing, Paul, in this letter, he's describing compartmentalization in a sense, or at least the cause of it. Knowledge is limited, people, but it's only limited because we limit ourselves from it. And those limitations produce distorted images of reality. Knowledge is one of the most valuable possessions. It's a rare commodity. And Christ warned his followers about the people that they shared the gospel with. Remember this? He said, pigs can't appreciate the value of pearls. So I guess in essence, knowledge means nothing to those who blindly conform to an institution without diligently seeking truth themselves. Our righteousness. I think a lot of people look at what they're doing. And I know this as a fact because I've communicated with several people about some of the topics in this book, and every time they come back with, we don't need you to look what we're doing. Look at the impact we've made. Our church is growing, and I've gotten these responses. People will point to what they have accomplished, and they will say, we don't need to listen to you because look at us, look what we've done. And I get those responses all the time. They're basically saying, we're successful without you. And what I see in that is that many Christians today believe their righteousness and their love for others justifies their decision to reject any knowledge outside of their comfort zone. They don't want to break tradition by investigating belief systems outside of their denominational upbringing. They look to their works and the good that they're doing in their community, and they focus on what they believe to be visible signs of success. signs such as church growth or ministries that have impacted their community. And these things are great. But unfortunately, churches can be so focused on what they're accomplishing that subconsciously they develop the impression that they are above correction. And in the book of Revelation, we're commanded to come out of the secular influence that has infiltrated the church. And ultimately, that's my prayer for the churches today, as well as the motive behind these videos and the book. I'm closing with that. And that, in a nutshell, that's compartmentalization. And I hope that it will open some eyes. I hope some people can get this information. I hope, see, when I wrote this, it was me looking into myself and what I had been through and seeing that I was compartmentalized for the longest. And talking about that's why I call this a truth journal. It's because I came out of that compartmentalized thinking, you know. And so, and that's what's hindering people a lot. It's not just what I talked about in the previous episode about cognitive dissonance. That's only one aspect of it. We got to look at how we've been compartmentalized too, about not just the psychology, but the circumstances. So there's a lot to it. I pray that I can open up some more people's eyes the way that that my eyes have been open. You know, if one person can put 100 to flight, 100 can put 10,000, or however, whatever the number is that Scripture talks about. So that's it for this video. Please like it, please share it, please give me some feedback on it. And if you want a copy of the book, it's in. I have a button on my YouTube, the home screen. You can read it for free. I have the PDF. There's a link to it. Or there's some other buttons for Amazon. If you want to visit my website, go to adenny.books.com. Denny, that's DENNY, books.com. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch up with you next time.